There is a letter that was never meant to be found. It had been placed inside a pale blue envelope, sealed with no ceremony, tucked between the pages of a leather-bound journal that sat in a wooden archive box for nearly 3 decades. Nobody marked it as important. Nobody flagged it for review. It was simply there, the way things that people hope will disappear quietly tend to remain perfectly preserved, absolutely undeniable, waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment came in the early months of 2024, when a team of royal archivists conducting a routine cataloging review at a private estate facility made an unexpected discovery. Among Diana, Princess of Wales's personal papers, letters, diary entries, handwritten notes, photographs, and documents accumulated over the course of her extraordinary and often painful life, there was a formal legal instrument that had never been made public. A will, not a draft, not a working copy. A signed, witnessed, and fully executed document that contradicted the official version of events surrounding her estate in ways that nobody inside the palace was prepared to explain. By the time the discovery was confirmed and verified by independent legal historians, the reaction from those closest to the crown was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger. It was grief. King Charles III, by all accounts from those present at the private briefing where the document's contents were first read aloud, sat very still for a long time after the room fell silent. Then, slowly, he removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Nobody needed to. What was in that document? What had Diana written in her own hand that could reach across 27 years and move a king to tears? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the fairy tale beginning, the wedding, the dress, the carriage, the balcony kiss. The real beginning. The one that happened behind closed doors, where a young woman slowly came to understand that the life she had been given and the life she had been promised were two entirely different things. Diana Frances Spencer was 19 years old when she became engaged to the Prince of Wales. By the time the world was finished celebrating, she had already begun to feel the first tremors of something she could not name. She had grown up in an aristocratic household, the daughter of an earl, familiar with the customs and protocols of upper-class English life. But nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for the specific, suffocating silence of royal existence. It was not a cruel silence. That might have been easier to resist. It was an institutional silence, the kind built over centuries, maintained by staff who looked through you and advisors who spoke around you, and a family whose emotional vocabulary had been pared down to almost nothing by generations of duty and distance. She tried to adapt. In the early years of her marriage, she threw herself into public life with a genuine enthusiasm that was not performance. The hospitals, the charities, the children's wards, this was not image management. Diana genuinely felt the pull toward people in pain. She had always been like that, even as a child, gravitating toward those who were struggling, instinctively kneeling down to be at eye level rather than standing above. It was not a strategy. It was simply who she was. But inside the marriage, she was slowly disappearing. Charles and Diana were, by nature and by circumstance, fundamentally incompatible people who had been brought together by a system that valued lineage and presentation over emotional truth. He was bookish, introverted, and steeped in philosophical melancholy. She was warm, reactive, deeply feeling, and still forming herself when the cameras first found her. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king. She had spent hers preparing for nothing in particular. The mismatch was not anyone's fault in the simple sense of the word. But the consequences were real, and Diana bore most of them. By the mid-1980s, the marriage had collapsed into a cold arrangement, two people sharing a title and a public role while living entirely separate emotional lives. Camilla Parker Bowles was a fact Diana could neither escape nor openly address. The isolation she felt was not dramatic in the way films later depicted it. It was mundane, long evenings alone, conversations that never went anywhere. A household where she was the most famous woman in the world and simultaneously, somehow, invisible. She began to document her life, not for publication, not then, but because writing was the only space where she felt entirely herself. Journals, letters, private notes to friends and to herself. Some of these documents eventually found their way into the public record through interviews and authorized biographies. Many did not. The wooden archive box that held her most private papers had been compiled with extreme care by those she trusted most, and after her death in August 1997, it had passed through several sets of hands before arriving at its long resting place. The question of Diana's estate had always been a complicated one, not only in financial terms, but in terms of what her death meant to the people who survived her. She died intestate in the legal sense that the will most widely known to the public, executed in 1993, was the operative document used to settle her estate after the courts made their rulings. That will left the majority of her assets to her two sons, William and Harry, with gifts designated for her 17 godchildren and provisions for her personal staff. It was a thoughtful document, carefully worded, and it was treated at the time as a complete record of her final wishes. What the archivists found in 2024 was something different. The document retrieved from the archive box was dated June 1997, 2 months before Diana's death. It had been drafted, according to the legal analysis subsequently conducted by 2 independent firms working separately to verify its authenticity, with the assistance of a private solicitor who was not part of the official palace-connected legal team Diana had previously used. The witnesses were 2 individuals whose identities were confirmed through cross-referencing with other documents in the archive. Both had since died, which complicated direct testimony, but the paper, the ink, the handwriting analysis, and the legal formatting all pointed to the same conclusion. This was real. This was hers. The contents of the will were not primarily about money. Diana had always been relatively clear in her financial intentions regarding her sons. What the 1997 document contained that the 1993 version did not was a series of personal directives. Requests, really, since personal directives in wills carry no legal enforcement mechanism. About how she wished to be remembered, how she wished her story to be told, and most significantly, what she wished to happen with her private papers. She had not wanted them locked away. She had not wanted them managed by palace advisors, or filtered through institutional gatekeepers, or released piecemeal in ways that protected anyone's reputation at the expense of truth. She had written, in language that was direct and unambiguous, that her private correspondence and journals should eventually be made available to an independent biographer of her son's choosing, someone with no connection to the royal household, so that the full record of her life could be preserved and presented honestly for history. This had not happened. Her papers had been carefully controlled in the years following her death. Some were released, curated, shaped. Others were sealed. The wooden archive box itself had been inaccessible for years, its location known only to a small number of people. Whether the 1997 will had been overlooked, suppressed, or simply lost in the chaos of the days following her death was a question that the 2024 discovery could not definitively answer. What it could do, and what it did do, was reopen every assumption about what Diana had wanted, and whether those wishes had been honored. The reaction from within the royal family was handled with the particular brand of composed discretion that the institution has practiced for over 1,000 years. There were no public statements. There were no press conferences. Officially, the palace neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the document while the legal and historical review was ongoing. But the briefing that took place behind closed doors, the one where Charles sat very still and pressed his fingers to his eyes, was not the only emotional moment the discovery triggered. People who were present at various points in the days following the internal review described a palpable shift in atmosphere, not chaos. The British royal family does not do chaos, at least not visibly, but something beneath the careful surface was moving. Old grief was resurfacing. Old questions were being asked again, this time with the weight of a discovered document behind them. Charles, in the years since Diana's death, had navigated his own complicated relationship with her legacy. He had been the villain in the public narrative for a long time. The man who made her unhappy, who chose another woman, who represented everything cold and remote about a family that the public had come to see as emotionally stunted by comparison to the warmth Diana radiated. He had lived with that characterization for decades. He had married Camilla, eventually found a measure of public acceptance, and had ascended to the throne after a reign of waiting that lasted his entire adult life. But Diana was never entirely behind him. She could not be. Her sons carried her face. Her memory had shaped the monarchy in ways that were still unfolding. The documentary evidence of her private suffering had been entering the public record in fragments for 30 years, and each fragment reopened wounds that never fully healed. When the 1997 will was read to him, Charles was confronted with something he had not anticipated, not accusation, not blame, but a voice. Her voice. The voice of a woman writing in the last weeks of her life, before the Paris trip, before the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, before everything. A woman who was, the document made clear, in a clearer and more purposeful state of mind than many had assumed. She had plans. She had intentions. She was thinking about the future, about her sons, about how history would treat her. There is something about a dead person's plans for the future that is uniquely devastating. It is not the same as hearing their last words or reading a final letter. Plans for the future imply confidence in a tomorrow that never came. Diana had written about what she wanted to happen eventually, someday, when the time was right. She did not know there would be no eventually. She did not know the time would stop in August of a summer year, in a French city far from home. That is perhaps what moved Charles to tears. Not guilt necessarily, though those who knew him well would not have been surprised if guilt was present somewhere in the emotion. But grief, genuine, unguarded grief for a woman whose life and death he had been connected to in ways no clean narrative could fully contain. William and Harry were informed separately. Their reactions, as described by those with knowledge of the private briefings, reflected the fundamental difference in their relationships to their mother's legacy that had defined much of their adult lives. William, who had spent years working carefully within the institutional framework while still finding ways to honor Diana's memory, responded with the controlled emotion that characterizes his public and private bearing. He asked detailed questions. He wanted to understand the provenance of the document, the legal implications, the timeline. He was not cold, those present were clear on that, but he processed in a particular way, moving through the practical before arriving at the personal. Harry's response, by contrast, was described as immediate and unguarded. He had spent years insisting that the full truth about his mother's life had been obscured and managed by the institution he had ultimately broken from. The discovery of a document expressing Diana's explicit wish for her story to be told honestly and independently was not, for Harry, a surprise. It was confirmation. It was the kind of validation that lands differently when it comes from the past rather than the present, not a living advocate speaking on your behalf, but your own mother, in her own handwriting, saying the thing you had been saying for years while people questioned your motives and your memory. The two brothers had not been in a good place with each other for some time. The discovery did not immediately change that, but it created, according to those with knowledge of the situation, a shared emotional reckoning that was unlike anything they had navigated together since the earliest years of their grief. Diana's 1997 will raised a series of questions that extended beyond the royal family and into broader public discourse about archival transparency, the management of public figures' estates, and the right of historical figures, particularly women who were systematically managed and controlled during their lifetimes, to have their expressed wishes honored posthumously. Legal experts who reviewed the case made clear that personal directives in a will, as distinct from financial and property distributions, are not legally enforceable in the same way. Nobody could be compelled by a court to release Diana's papers simply because she had asked for them to be released. But the moral and historical weight of a discovered document expressing those wishes was something different from legal compulsion. It was a public conversation that, once started, was very difficult to close. Historians who specialized in royal archives and the management of elite family records pointed to a broader pattern in which the private documents of royal women, queens, consorts, and princesses across centuries, had routinely been edited, suppressed, or shaped by institutional interests rather than personal intention. Diana's case was not unique in kind, they argued, but it was unique in scale and visibility, given the extraordinary global attention her life and death had commanded. What the discovery ultimately did was remind everyone that Diana had never stopped being a person in the midst of all the symbolism. Behind the icon, behind the tragedy, behind the decades of documentary tributes and memorial specials and contested biographies, there had been a woman with a handwriting style that leaned slightly to the right, who sealed her letters in pale blue envelopes, who made plans for a future she fully intended to inhabit. A woman who trusted that what she wrote would eventually matter to the right people in the right way. She was not wrong, it just took longer than she expected. The archive box was photographed and catalogued in full by the independent review team. The 1997 will was placed under secure preservation. Discussions about the future management of Diana's private papers were ongoing as of the time of this account, with no final determination having been made public. The palace continued its policy of not commenting on the specific contents of private documents. But the conversation had already moved beyond what any official position could contain. The document existed. It had been found. It said what it said in Diana's hand, witnessed and dated. And the man who had once been her husband, now a king, older and grayer and more alone than the photographs usually showed, had sat very still in a quiet room and felt something arrive that he could not push away. Whatever that feeling was, he was the only one who knew its full shape. Whether it was sorrow or regret or something more complicated that has no single name, it belonged entirely to him, in that room, in that silence, when her voice reached him one last time from a pale blue envelope that had been waiting, patiently and without judgment, for nearly 3 decades. Some things do not disappear just because we hope they will. They wait, and eventually they are found.